Good morning. Here we are in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your descendants be named." He considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. Hence, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So this is talking about what is recorded for us in Genesis 22, 1 to 10. If you want to read it there, you can see exactly what Abraham did. He had waited for a very long time for Isaac, the child of promise, to come. And now this child was a teenager, probably about 13 years old or 14 years old. The promise had been fulfilled. The son had been born. But the promise was, through Isaac shall your descendants be named. That promise is given in Genesis 21:12. And when God said to Abraham that he should offer Isaac as a sacrifice, he really believed that God could bring Isaac back to life. Because the promise, the secondary promise, first was the promise that he would have descendants more than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. But the second promise was specifically that it would be through Isaac that his descendants would be named. And so he went up that mountain ready to kill his son, believing that God would bring him back to life. He had walked with God so long that it was quite clear to him that it was the voice of God he was hearing. Now that may seem very strange to us, because none of us perhaps would ever believe that God would actually say something like that. But for me, I've always thought of the offering of Isaac on that mountain was God sharing with his best friend of the time the pain God knew was coming when his own son, Jesus, would be offered up on the cross. And there is something in the heart of God that wants empathy, that wants a relationship, that wants closeness and understanding. And no one could ever understand what it cost the heart of God to put Jesus on the cross for us than someone who actually willingly sacrificed his own son, because that's exactly what God did. He willingly sacrificed his own son and watched him die for the sake of others. That's what God did. The immensity of the plan of salvation is enormous. And just as Abraham knew God could raise Isaac from the dead, God the Father knew that he would raise Jesus from the dead. But that didn't make the pain of watching him die any easier. Abraham, this sacrifice of his son, is a great, great picture in so many ways of the plan of salvation. And when God provided a lamb or a ram for the sacrifice, what he was saying really was that you don't need to kill your own son. I'm going to give you the sacrifice for sin. I'm going to give it for you myself. Symbolizing again Jesus, our Lord. But the faith of Abraham, this was an immense event in the life of Abraham. And it was by faith. He did it because he knew he'd heard from God. Both occasions he'd heard from God, promising that through Isaac his descendants would be named. He knew the voice of God when before that God had promised that he would have a son through whom his descendants would come. And he knew that that same voice of God had told him to sacrifice Isaac up on the mountain. And his determination to do it was shown clearly in the fact that he took many days walking with Isaac, climbing that mountain, ready to sacrifice him, knowing that God had not said at any time. Perhaps he'd said, I don't know, perhaps he'd said to God, do you really want me to do this? Do you really want me to do this? And when he said to Isaac, the Lord himself will provide. I think that's what he said. Let me just look it up. Genesis 22, let me get it right. I don't want to misquote it. It's such an important passage. Genesis 22. Genesis 22, verse 7. Isaac said to his father Abraham, this was on the journey, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them, together. And I believe that God had said to Abraham, I will provide a lamb for the burnt offering. And that Abraham, maybe I don't know, because he got ready even with the knife in his hand, put his son on the altar. Maybe he still thought of his son as the lamb. But God had given him a word and said, I will provide a lamb for the burnt offering. And then at the last moment, God showed him a ram. God tested him right up until the last moment to see whether he would follow the instructions by faith. And he did by faith. And I think it says to us, there are times when God asks us to do things that don't make any kind of sense. He asks us to do things which horrify us, which make us think, this can't be God. And yet we know the voice of God. And we know that God is asking it of us. I wonder if that's what some of those martyrs who were beheaded by ISIS recently, not that recent, but a few years ago, those poor men who were beheaded and videoed and so on, if they knew that they would die as martyrs. Sometimes it's hard to know, but as we go on in our walk with God, we need to reach the stage where we readily recognize the voice of God, because we've heard it so often and we've responded to it, and we've known the assurance that it was God that spoke to us. This was a very difficult test for Abraham, and this walk of faith from Abraham is such an astonishing example for us to follow. That Abraham knew God well enough to know that this was the voice of God that he had heard, and that God had a plan, but he needed to test Abraham to show him as the father of faith. It's why we are all called children of Abraham, because we walk in faith just as Abraham did. Abraham did not do all that he did knowing what was coming. He did all that he did not knowing that the answer would come in the way that it did. He followed in obedience. And that's all that God asks of us, is that when we hear his voice, we obey what he says. And we do it in faith, even when we don't know what the outcome is going to be. Even if we're like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and we don't know if God is going to rescue us or not, we still will stand in faith like they did. Let's stand in faith together. It's a lot to think about today, and I hope it will bless you as you think through the sacrifice of Isaac that Abraham was ready to do. God bless you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.